Beatrice Quimby's biggest problem was her little sister Ramona. Beatrice, or Beezus as everyone called her.
One Friday afternoon, Henry Huggins was on the front steps of his White House on Clickitat Street with his dog.
Beverly Cleary is one of the greatest writers in the history of Oregon.
She's a rock star.
I think she's a great author, and I really enjoy reading her books.
And B, one of the greatest writers in the history of America.
She does more with one sentence than a lot of writers can do with a whole chapter.
And C, one of the greatest writers in the history of the planet, because why? Beverly Cleary has sold 99 million books.
Sometimes when you go back and read books that you loved as a kid and they just don't seem to work anymore, her books do.
She's awesome.
Support for Discovering Beverly Cleary is provided by the Kinsman Foundation, Kay Kitagawa and Andy Johnson Laird, Sharon and Keith Barnes, Oregon Arts Commission, Ronnie Lecroute, Weiss Foundation, and the following, and viewers like you. Thank you.
Henry sighed. He wanted a bicycle now. He could see himself riding up and down Clickitat Street on a shiny red bicycle. He would wear his genuine Daniel Boone coonskin cap.
I know when I first moved to Portland and I was walking my dog down the street, Clickitat Street. Where do I know Clickitat Street? That's a funny name. And then I realized that Ramona and Beezus and Henry all lived on Clickitat Street. And I thought, my gosh, I never thought that was a real place. I thought it was Generica. It seemed so much like where I was growing up, even though I was growing up in a big city, Brooklyn, New York. And I went and got out a lot of books from the library, started rereading them, and all of a sudden I realized I'm in Beverly Cleary's neighborhood.
Beverly Cleary is an award-winning author whose books have been treasured by millions of young readers. At age 99, she sat down with us for a rare look back on her life and celebrated career.
Well, it was just work that I enjoyed. I could do it at home, and I didn't have to catch a bus.
She created characters who've been loved by 3 generations: Ramona Quimby and her big sister Beezus, Henry Huggins, Ralph S. Mouse and his motorcycle, Socks the cat, and many more.
When someone hears the name Beverly Cleary, it immediately evokes this emotional response of, I learned to read with her books, or I remember her characters. I mean, it's pretty amazing how many millions of lives she's touched with her stories.
Socks rolled over on his back and swiped at her with one white paw.
She is a woman who wrote about kids that weren't being written about. I love that middle-class family. The family felt very much like my family. So I would say that she was a person that pushed boundaries in her time.
Beverly Atlee Bunn was born April 12, 1916, to Lloyd and Mabel Bunn. Both sides of her family were pioneers who had migrated west to Oregon. The family lived in a farmhouse on 80 acres in rural Yamhill, Oregon, population 350.
Her father was a farmer, and he loved being a farmer, and he was a very good farmer. But in those days, before agricultural price supports, you couldn't make a living on the farm. You could have a bumper crop and still lose money. Her mother was trained as a teacher, very well-read, very educated, but a married woman did not teach back then. So our mother had to stay home.
I had resisted learning to read. My mother wanted to teach me, but I felt, well, why should I when she can read to me?
The farm seemed like a playground for young Beverly. Both parents were busy, and she was free to wander and explore. She describes her childhood in her memoir, A Girl from Yamhill.
Sunny afternoons, I sat among the windfalls under an apple tree that bore cream-colored apples with pink cheeks. Sniffing the sun-warmed fruit, taking one bite, throwing the rest of the apple away, and biting into another. The first bite of an apple tastes best.
Her mother opened the first library in Yamhill. Beverly was more interested in playing outside.
Well, it was wonderful. There was so much to look at and do, but the one thing that was missing was other children.
Eventually, the financial stress of farm life became too much for Lloyd and Mabel. When Beverly was 6, the family leased their acreage and moved 40 miles north.
Portland, city of regular paychecks, concrete sidewalks, streetcars, a library with a children's room, buildings so high a 6-year-old almost fell over backward looking at the tops.
Young Beverly started Fernwood Grammar School in a classroom with almost 40 students.
It was terrifying. I'd never associated with all those children.
She still didn't know how to read.
Oh, I remember a moment of terror in the first grade when we were today it'd be called a reading circle. And I'd figured ahead and what word I was going to have to read. And it was city. And I knew it wasn't pronounced kitty, but I didn't know how. My turn came, I had to say kitty because I couldn't remember what it was. And I was reprimanded by the teacher.
Beverly was placed into the lowest reading group, the Blackbirds. It was 2 long years before she got her first hint that reading might have some value.
The book was The Dutch Twins by Lucy Fitch Perkins. I was really just looking at the pictures and discovered I was reading it and enjoying what I read. It was quite a revelation.
Enjoying reading inspired her to be creative in a school writing assignment.
And I got carried away and made up quite a tale about giving my pet chicken to feed the troops. The teacher said that mine was the only one acceptable, and I didn't have to do it over. And I felt pretty smug about that.
When the school librarian, Miss Smith, suggested that she should consider becoming a writer, Beverly felt like she had found her path. But the summer before she started high school, her father lost his job. Oregon, along with the rest of the country, was reeling from the stock market crash of 1929.
We were locked in the grip of the Great Depression. It was very sad, the number of men who would come around door to door trying to sell pencils. My mother and I reached the point where we'd hide when we saw them coming. We couldn't face them because we didn't have money for the extra pencils.
Her mother insisted that Beverly find a way to support herself if she planned to become a writer. The young woman who had refused to learn to read chose a career as a librarian.
Once she graduated from the University of Washington, she became a youth services librarian. Her first position was at a library in Yakima, which is in the eastern side of the state of Washington.
That's where I learned to write for children. Standing up and telling the story. I didn't read the story, I told it.
After a year in Yakima, she married Clarence Cleary and became Beverly Cleary. When the couple bought a home in Berkeley, California with a spare room, it was finally time to try writing.
On January 2nd, 1949, I gathered up my typewriter, freshly sharpened pencils, and the pile of paper, and sat down at the kitchen table we had stored in the back bedroom. Write, and no backing out, I told myself.
I expected to write about the maturing of a sensitive female, and I sat down, and I waited, and no ideas came. And I thought about the little boy in the Yakima Public Library who faced me rather ferociously once and said, "Where are the books about kids like us?" And it changed my whole attitude.
So in my imagination, I stood once more before Yakima's Story Hour crowd as I typed the first sentence. Henry Huggins was in the 3rd grade. Where Henry's name came from, I do not know. It was just there, waiting to be written. But I do know Henry was inspired by the boys on Hancock Street, who seemed eager to jump onto the page.
Mrs. Cleary imagined Henry riding a bus in downtown Portland, rescuing a dog, Ribsy, and spending time in his neighborhood. She put the stories together into a manuscript and mailed it to a publishing company to see if it could become a book.
I had heard that if you don't hear within 6 weeks when you send a manuscript in, you can write and ask about it. And the weeks were going by.
The mailman wondered what she was waiting for. She told him that a big brown envelope would mean a rejected manuscript, but a long white envelope might be a publishing contract.
And when the long white envelope arrived, he came running down the garden steps to get it to me a few seconds faster.
It was a letter of acceptance. Her first book, Henry Huggins, was published in 1950 and was an immediate success.
Henry Huggins was in the 3rd grade. His hair looked like a scrubbing brush, and most of his grown-up front teeth were in. He lived with his mother and father in a square white house on Klickitat Street.
The original Ramona, Henry, Ribsy, and Ralph S. Mouse were drawn by Louis Darling. The illustrations are considered iconic and defined Beverly Cleary's characters until Mr. Darling died in 1970.
In the original, they're driving cars from the 50s, and the neighbors are wearing pillbox hats and, high heels and skirts, and I put the neighbors in, like sweatpants.
Tracy Dockeray is one of several illustrators who have updated the images over the years.
Ramona is such a wonderful character because she's so enthusiastic about life. And she wants to do the right thing. Whether it's being the quietest at nap time, she's gonna nap the hardest, and then she thinks, I'm gonna snore the loudest, and then she gets in trouble. I like that she's flawed, and I like that she really feels so many different emotions for us.
Tracy was commissioned to re-illustrate The Mouse and the Motorcycle. Before she started, she received a card from Beverly Cleary.
And I opened it up and it said, Super, you're doing the next books, but your mouse ears are too big. You need to get a mouse model. Oddly enough, I'm walking down the sidewalk with my children in nursery school, and on the sidewalk is a small gray baby mouse. And I knew that this little baby mouse was going to get squished like a bug on the sidewalk of Fifth Avenue. And he became my mouse model and sat right beside my desk in a little cage for his entire life.
Ramona looked skeptical. She grabbed the pencil again and wrote with a flourish. "That's mining because I like it," she announced. "I like to make dots and lines."
What's unique to her style is the fact that she has the ability to get inside children's heads and present the worlds that they live in.
Beverly was kind of the pioneer in that sort of genre of children's literature, of having characters that kids could really resonate with and just living real-life experiences.
The books that Beverly Cleary was writing were revolutionary for her time because girl characters were not given that kind of freedom on the page to say what they want, to behave in the way that they want. They were supposed to be prim, proper, and nice and sweet.
"I do not spoil your fun," stormed Ramona. "You have all the fun. I can't read, and it isn't fair."
Ramona, to me, was so revolutionary. And when I encountered her when I was 8 reading, I just thought, this is the girl that I was, someone who spoke my mind, someone who was very much a little rebellious, especially in my home with my family, so it was very refreshing to find her on the page.
She's curious, she's impulsive, like children her age would be. And she feels the joy of life so much that she just bursts out with it. It may not be polite or the thing adults would approve of, but when you have a pair of new boots and there's a mud puddle, you just have to jump through it. And every child knows that feeling. It's simply the joy of being alive.
There are bits of me and Ramona and bits of other people.
Look. Look.
As you're walking through the neighborhood, just imagine Beverly walking through the neighborhood, because this was where she hung out. This used to be the front entrance to Fernwood Grammar School, and this is where Beverly went to school.
When her daughters were young, Laura Foster read Beverly Cleary books with them. She discovered references to places in her neighborhood that seemed familiar. Laura's a travel author, known for designing tours, so she created a Beverly Cleary walk around the neighborhood.
The process of making the tour, I find the relevant kind of data points in a neighborhood, and in this case, the data points were her life, places in her life and places in the characters' lives. She walked down these very same sidewalks, and she would sit on that porch in the summer and knit or do needlepoint, and they lived here until she was just about ready to start Grant High School. She loved the street. It became the street that she called Click-a-Tat in her book. She liked the sound of Click-a-Tat better than Hancock because it's just more fun. She said it sounded like clacking of knitting needles. So who's this?
Henry?
Yes, good, Henry Huggins. And he was her first character that she wrote about. And then who's that right behind you there? Ramona. And Ramona, Beverly says, is the #1 character that she gets fan letters about. This is Grant High School, that red brick building. And she was encouraged by her teacher here to find a writing career because she was so good. And this is the field that Beverly would collect night crawlers. In the book, Henry Huggins, he was out here at night when the sprinklers were on and the lights were on. He could hear kids in the nearby pool. The only thing that's probably changed since Beverly's time is that the trees have gotten bigger.
Ever since she started writing books, Beverly Cleary has lived in California, far away from the rainy streets of Portland that she remembers.
I wrote in the mornings. As soon as the breakfast dishes were done, I worked until lunchtime, and then I was through for the day.
It wasn't easy to work at home, especially after her twins, Malcolm and Marianne, were born.
Well, I took care of the house with one hand and wrote with the other.
We didn't appear to be any different than any other families that I knew. Perhaps the only difference was our mailbox was the biggest one you could buy because of the amount of fan mail that she got. My childhood is well documented.
On one family trip to England, Malcolm ended up sick in bed.
I was doing what small boys do with model cars and toys. I was making noises and zooming them around.
And when we came home, a neighbor called me over and showed me a mouse that had fallen in a bucket in her garden. And it crossed my mind that mouse was just the right size to ride that little motorcycle. That's the kind of messy mind I have.
The book, The Mouse and the Motorcycle, introduced a new character, Ralph S. Mouse, who would star in 2 other books as well as a movie.
Beverly was unique among all the authors I've worked with for the 30 years I was in publishing. She's the only author that didn't have a book contract before she delivered a manuscript.
By the time David Ruther started working as Beverly Cleary's editor in 1982, she'd written more than 24 books, sold millions of copies, and received acclaim. But one award had eluded her.
One day she called me up and said, "I'm sending you a new manuscript." And of course I was delighted. I just arrived at Morrow. I was really eager to work with Beverly. I closed my office door, I read for a couple of hours, called her in tears. I said, "Beverly, this is absolutely amazing. I think the best thing you've ever written." And Beverly said, "Oh, thank God. I'm so relieved." And I was astonished. I said, "But Beverly, you've published 24 books. They've all been bestsellers. You've won many, many, many awards. Surely you must know when something you've written is good." And she said, "No." She said, "When I'm working on it, I have no idea whether it's good or not."
Caldecott Award-winning illustrator Paul O. Zielinski added drawings.
The illustrations, they don't tell the same exact story. They can't because they're not in the same medium. They tell other things alongside the story as the story's going on.
That book, Dear Mr. Henshaw, won the most prestigious award for children's literature in the United States, the Newbery Medal.
I call her the Ernest Hemingway of children's books simply because her writing is so deceptively simple.
Eric Kimmel was a professor of education at Portland State University for decades.
Surprisingly, a lot of my students who had grown up in Portland all their lives had either never heard of her or thought that, oh yeah, I knew those books. I didn't know they took place here. And that started to bother me because I thought if we were in Europe, there would be monuments or ways to honor our important cultural people, artists and writers.
The Friends of Henry and Ramona Committee was formed to honor Beverly Cleary with a statue garden in Northeast Portland. They commissioned Oregon sculptor Lee Hunt.
For me, it was important to create a dramatic space for children and adults to play in, to become a part of those characters and to become a part of the stories.
Mrs. Cleary and her husband Clarence visited Lee's studio while she was creating the statues.
She was encouraging, helpful. She said she wanted Ramona to look like she was experiencing absolute joy.
That project was put together by the contributions of children and Beverly Cleary fans all over the country, and in fact, all over the world.
Libraries would put up penny jars in their children's library, and kids would put their pennies in the jars, and then the libraries would send us checks.
We are here today to honor an author, a librarian, and a friend. Beverly Cleary is the author.
On October 13, 1995, the statues were dedicated. Beverly Cleary and Clarence, along with almost 1,000 spectators, attended the ceremony.
I grew up reading the Ramona series. And it was such a gift to be able to recognize places in the book and feel like I was reading about someone who came from a place that I came from. Beverly's effect on me has been giving me permission to write about my hometown, my neighborhood. Writing about Portland is also trying to answer some questions that I had when I was a teenager living here about race, about class, about what it means to be a person of color living in a mostly white state. When I look at my work and reread some of hers, I'm like, oh yeah, she absolutely had an influence on me, and it stayed all those years.
I was born in Cuba, but I immigrated to the U.S. when I was about 3. And my family lived very close to a branch of the local library. And so my mom used to take my brother and I there, partly so that we'd become readers, but also partly so that we would learn English better.
The librarian suggested books that she thought young Annamari would enjoy.
My memory is that the very first one was Beezus and Ramona. I just loved the Beezus books, the ones with Ramona, and then the Henry Huggins. I am quite sure that I have read every single one. In many ways, they were my introduction to this country. I have one more memory. It's part of why Ramona and Beezus were so special to me, and that's that in most U.S. books, the kids have blonde hair. She could be Cuban. These were kids that looked like us.
Okay, it's time to take out a good book and find a comfortable spot and read.
Each year, on April 12th, Beverly Cleary's birthday, schools and communities participate in Drop Everything and Read Day, which Ramona made famous.
How do we get kids to fall in love with reading? How do we get them to fall in? Well, Ramona helped me fall in and kind of find my place. And so I wanted to study children's literature. I wanted to study how books like hers were able to create an entire genre.
Henry Huggins was in the 3rd grade. His hair looked like a scrubbing brush,
and most of his grown-up front teeth were in.
He lived with his mother and father in a square white house on Cleary Street.
The books that she wrote in the 50s are still, I think, read and loved by people as much as they were then. And That's extraordinary.
Beverly Cleary's books are enjoyed around the world and have been translated into more than 14 languages. And in 2000, Beverly Cleary was designated a Library of Congress Living Legend. Just 3 years later, she was awarded a National Medal of Arts by President George W. Bush.
Beverly Cleary is one of the most significant children's writers in the whole pantheon of American children's literature.
She just had so many stories and ideas that she needed to share and characters that she wanted to share. And I think that was her destiny, to share those children and those stories with generations of children.
I just have a good memory. And I think it was probably living 6 years on a farm where I didn't have a lot of distractions. I learned by observing and remembering.
It's about Mrs. Cleary, because without her, we would not have these wonderful books. And it's wonderful books that inspire children to be readers.
When you reread Beverly Cleary's in your 40s and 50s and 60s, it's just as good as the first time.
The young woman from Yamhill, Oregon, who started school in the lowest reading group, changed writing for children forever.
Oh yes, it's been happy all the way. I've had a long and exceptionally happy career.